I finally finished.
That's what she said.
The Rebel Moon director's cuts. Are they better? Let's discuss. What's up, Flick fans? Let's dive into Rebel Moon. If you're here and you enjoyed these director's cuts or you thought they were significantly worse, let me know down below. And just to preface, I was not a fan of the first two Rebel Moon movies. I thought the first one was just sloppily edited, it moved too slowly, didn't learn enough about the characters. I thought the second one was even more boring, a fun-ish last 30 minutes, but it took so long to get there, and there was much to be desired when it came to learning about these characters. So, in a way, I was excited to see what Zack Snyder actually had in mind for this universe, but in another way, it's like, do I want to watch what I already hated just longer and more pointless? And I say pointless not because we're getting his true version. That's awesome. I'm all for the director giving us what he originally intended. But here's why I question the entire thing, and a lot of other people have had this question as well. Netflix was supposed to give Zack Snyder full freedom to give us the movie that he wanted to give, but they said, you know what, we're going to make the cuts that we show people initially PG-13 because I think that's just going to work out better for us. And my question is, why? Because it makes no sense. Well, Austin, they're letting him make his movie and release it later on in the year. Okay.
Go crazy. Go stupid.
Why didn't they just release that to start? That's what makes no sense. It's like they were trying to, I think I figured it out. They were trying to manufacture a Snyder Cut to capitalize on the Snyder Cut madness with DC and say, you know what, we can do our own Snyder Cut. But here's the problem with that. The initial movies that they released were bad. So why would people get excited for a Snyder Cut version of a movie that features brand new characters and doesn't have the lore of the DC universe? Of course people were wanting to see a better Justice League, but to say the general audience at least was wanting to see a better version of these Rebel Moon movies that they hated, I question that decision because, frankly, just me saying it out loud, it sounds like nonsense. It's pure stupidity. And so, for them to tell him that they were giving him freedom, and they technically did, but to do it in such a dumb way, and here's why I hate it the most, because these director's cut versions of Rebel Moon that I just watched, they are significantly better. But the problem is, the general audience, a lot of which don't even really know who directs what movie, they just see 2 to 3 movies a year, they don't care who does what, they watch those Rebel Moon movies and they're saying to themselves, why would I want to see another version of that? Well, I would say, this version's better. This is clearly more of what Zack Snyder intended, but they're just going to roll their eyes, scoff, and not watch him. And we've seen that this weekend because the numbers for these 2 Rebel Moon movies drastically low. I mean, from what I'm seeing, around like 3 million compared to 26 million for the first Rebel Moon, and that's not what we wanted. As a Zack Snyder, apologist in a way, I tend to really appreciate some of his movies. I'm rooting for Army of the Dead. They just said this morning Army of the Dead may not have another movie. I'm rooting for that to get a sequel. I enjoyed that movie, but I didn't enjoy Rebel Moons Part 1 and 2, and I'm upset because I knew these versions would be better. They are better. Why not release them? And yeah, well, they're not going to make a lot of money in theaters if they're rated R. They're not going to theaters. Deadpool and Wolverine also just proved that wrong by making $1 billion at the box office. It's an R-rated movie, so this entire thing just doesn't make sense to me. Is this video just an excuse for me to rant? Yes, but I'm not ranting because I'm anti-Zack Snyder. I'm ranting because these movies were better. These movies are the ones that deserve to be seen. And that's what's crazy about this entire thing.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
We have Chalice of Blood and The Curse of Forgiveness. Different subtitles, so you know they're different movies. And, to a degree, these films are just kind of extended versions of what we saw in the prior 2 movies. But they're edited together in a way that actually makes more sense, gives us backstory for our characters. And off the bat in this first film, we get a prologue of sorts that just wasn't in the original cut. Like 15 minutes of brand new footage where this cute little creature comes out. Well, you start to figure out, okay, this is an R-rated cut of this movie. We're back, baby. And Ed Skrein, who was one of my favorite parts of the first versions of these films, is absolutely more fleshed out in these versions, but more menacing. There's something about being able to see him more aggressively do the things that he did in the first film, because again, you're going to have a lot more violence and blood here, but also the extra scenes that we get for his character in the first movie specifically made him a more compelling villain. He was already chewing up the scenery, but I really like what that first little sequence added. And then all of the sequences in between, and the fact that the first version of this director's cut of Rebel Moon is just so much more fleshed out. Now, I'm not going to say the pacing is great, because it's a 3-something hour movie. It's long. I feel like this should have been a limited series or maybe cut up into 3 different films. The pacing is still a problem, but the way that everything is edited together makes a lot more sense. And I was actually kind of rooting for our team that's being assembled and our heroes individually, especially Sofia Boutella's character, who is so much more compelling in this version. And not because they're adding a bunch of stuff. I mean, here's the difference, right? We know it's rated R because they're adding sex scenes in this movie. Hardcore sex scenes. That really didn't do much for me. I didn't, well, not in that way.
You are disgusting. You'll never find love.
I didn't feel as if that was a requirement for those two characters, if that added a lot to them. I guess for some it will, but for me it's like, it's rated R, so he's adding in a sex scene. And I was afraid that's what this entire movie would feel like. But the added violence, the added blood and gore, which some people are just going to scoff at, I feel as if that entrenches us in this world a bit more. And honestly, the action sequences, they take away some of the slow-mo as well. And that's another big issue I have with the first versions of these. They solely relied on slow motion in moments. And that's a cool stylistic decision when you use it sparingly. But Zack Snyder doesn't use it sparingly. But in these versions, while still used, it's used a bit more sparingly. And so I was really impressed with the action this time around. Yeah, we get more of it, obviously, but it meant more, as did these scenes that just weren't present in the initial cut. And so I would say within the confines of the first film, I saw an improvement, but a lot was going to rely on how they did part 2 this time around, because I found that to be worse than the first originally, because we spent a lot of time in these fields, and it was so boring. Boring! And I get it. I see what he's trying to do here. Combine Star Wars with Seven Samurai, the Magnificent Seven, a Western setting type of deal, but in space. It's a big sci-fi epic. I understood the references, but it just felt like a big generic version. Parts 1 and 2, a generic version of Star Wars, a poorly written Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai, however you want to put it, right? Well, this version of Part 2 feels more like what he was trying to achieve was present while I was watching, because while we do get a lot of flashbacks, a lot of backstories, a lot of building of these characters as we are preparing for this hour-long series of battles at the end of this second movie, I was able to chew on those moments just a bit more and care more at the end, right? Still a little overlong. I still feel as if the writing fell a little short and the pacing was a little up and down, right? But I felt it much more so watching this version. And as someone who was rolling his eyes hitting play on these director's cuts, because I knew how much I could not stand the first 2 versions, holding on to the fact that I appreciate Zack Snyder, I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised by these director's cuts, meaning this got much closer to delivering on that initial promise from Zack Snyder. All of those things that he said this was trying to be, again, trying to be, did not quite get there. Still feel a little bit of that generic Star Wars in there, but I was a lot more entertained. I was a lot more invested. I genuinely felt as if some of the backstories they were giving to these characters were great, especially Anthony Hopkins' robot. I mean, Jimmy is, well, he's fascinating here because of his now fight against his Imperial bosses. Being voiced by Anthony Hopkins helps absolutely, but it didn't really help the first time around. This time around, his motivation is felt a lot more, and I was actually a big fan of the way that character was handled, so much more in this version than the previous version. There are also some other robot characters here that are just insane, as well as this interdimensional being character who is powering the villain's ships. Now, I do want to say, I watched an interview with Zack Snyder where he said in the PG-13 cuts, he doesn't really get to tell a less straightforward story than what Netflix wanted him to tell. Again, it feels like they're being controlling in this entire thing, even though he was supposed to have freedom. It's more straightforward and less like this crazy dream that we are experiencing, which is how I felt during the director's cuts, where they're kind of playing on the genre a bit more instead of just telling a really straightforward story that's just really choppy and poorly edited. That's what the original two felt like, right? This feels like you're watching a fever dream of sorts. You're getting all of the same information, but it feels a little more streamlined in a weird sense, a little more in-depth, and it's trying to say something differently than what the first two Rebel Moons were saying. And that's editing and removing integral sequences and backstories. Taking something out like that can just change the entire outcome of a movie. That's why getting your vision out there is so important, whether it be good or bad. Sometimes getting your vision out there is a bad decision, but in the instances I've seen with Zack Snyder, it always improves the experience, and that's the same way here. The first movie especially, it improves so much, and even though it's longer, it felt like it was moving quicker. It really did. I felt that I was getting towards some sort of culmination conclusion a lot faster. Now, part two, again, you know, the first two acts of part two, we're still in the midst of that building, but it's a less exciting building, and it's more of, okay, can we just get to the final big, crazy blockbuster sequence that we're all waiting for? And we get there. And it's a conclusion of sorts. It's the Avengers Endgame of this world, right? Everything's coming together. You get the big battles and all the blood and the gore that you want, which, again, some people are going to find to be unnecessary. That's a great payoff. Part two still, unfortunately, felt as if it didn't need to include some of the things that it did. Distinctly different, which I do appreciate, but a lot of these flashing back and forth sequences and just spending so much time in the fields, man. Why do we spend so much time in the fields?
2 hours is long enough!
That being said, these versions are still better in totality. I'm choosing to look at this as one movie, so a weaker second half than a first half, but ultimate payoff and culmination that I guess warrants a lot of that build-up, and these are things I could not say about the original versions of Rebel Moon. I did have a way better time with these, even though it is, again, 6 hours. Shouldn't really need to be 6 hours. Why didn't we just make a limited series or 3 movies? I don't know. But I will say now, whatever version we get of Part 3, I will be watching Part 3, whereas before, I was thinking about tapping out. There is no denying that these are Snyder's cuts of the movie, whether it be a manufactured Snyder cut, meaning didn't need to be a Snyder cut in the first place, just release the good versions of the movies. I will never understand the decision behind why they did what they did, and it's costing these versions views that, frankly, I believe they deserve. I believe these versions deserve 26 million views as opposed to what got 26 million views. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Are my frustrations warranted? Did you like these versions better? Can you even find yourself wanting to go back after the first couple of experiences? Let me know your thoughts down below. This is a safe place and space to talk about your thoughts on the director's cuts of Rebel Moon, which I am giving a thumbs up for, especially when you play that comparison game, man. So thumbs up for me. Go watch these. If you enjoyed the first versions, go watch these. If you struggle with the first versions, if you hated them with everything in you, I don't know if this is going to win you over, to be honest. But as someone who is always rooting for Zack Snyder to come through, he doesn't always do that. But in this case, these are at least better versions. All right, I'll see you soon.